Hi, everyone.
Greetings. We made the point when we started this playlist on the Proclaimer's book, 3 years ago, that the whole book is a masterpiece of propaganda. This chapter is another good example of that. They're in chapter 14, they are no part of the world, and then the second subhead, they are separate and distinct from Babylon the Great. Now, a lot of what they say in here is accurate, but a lot of what they don't say will change the entire picture once you know what they omit. And their gross generalizations, well, there's part truth in almost every generalization, but it's not enough truth. And that does change the picture when you know that they're misrepresenting even Christendom to make it part of Babylon the Great, and something you should completely
and misrepresenting their own history.
Yeah.
By omitting certain things or not telling you what they actually said at the time.
Now, let's just read the 3 paragraphs under this subhead and see if everybody out there can notice what might be missing or what might be subject to the accusation of gross generalization here. The first paragraph says, to be no part of the world, they had to be no part of religious systems that were deeply involved in the affairs of the world, and that had absorbed doctrines and customs from ancient Babylon, the longtime enemy of true worship. When the First World War erupted, the Bible students had for decades been exposing the pagan roots of such doctrines of Christendom as the Trinity, immortality of the human soul, and hellfire. They had also laid bare the Church's record of trying to manipulate governments for their own selfish ends. Because of Christendom's doctrines and practices, the Bible students had identified it with Babylon the Great. They pointed out that it mixed truth with error. Oh, that's an insight that they don't always display, right? They pointed out that Babylon, mixed truth with error, lukewarm Christianity with outright worldliness, and that the biblical designation, Babylon, meaning confusion, that's accurate, by the way, well described that condition. They urged lovers of God to get out of Babylon. To that end, late in December 1917, and early in 1918, they distributed 10 million copies of the issue of the Bible Students Monthly that featured the subject, The Fall of Babylon, which was a hard-hitting expose of Christendom. This in turn resulted in bitter animosity from the clergy, who exploited wartime hysteria in an endeavor to crush the work of Jehovah's Witnesses.
Of necessity, getting out of Babylon the Great involves withdrawing from membership in the organizations that advocated her false doctrines. The Bible students did that, although for many years they viewed as Christian brothers those individuals in the churches who professed full consecration and faith in the ransom. Nevertheless, not only did the Bible students write letters of withdrawal from Christendom's churches, but when possible, some would read theirs aloud at church meetings, where it was in order for members to speak up. If this was not possible, they might send a copy of their letter of withdrawal, a kindly one, containing an appropriate witness to every member of the congregation. Wow.
Okay, so you have made the point, and I think you're telling the truth, that in those days, if not today, you used to point out that Babylon the Great mixed truth with error. But I can't think of a more obvious example of mixing truth with error than this. Right? A lot of fact is in here, even some generalizations that are mostly factual, but most of it is gross generalizations, i.e. misleading, and also factual generalizations or factual errors that are right at the beginning of this analysis. First of all, the loading up of religious language again. In this case, it's the phrase religious systems. This is not how Christendom talks, by the way, of religious systems, or what's the other word they use? Organizations, membership in organizations. They don't talk in those terms. Why? Because they think of people in other denominations as also being Christian. They don't think of them as because they're not in our organization. They're not.
They talk churches, they talk the body of Christ and believers, but they don't talk what organization. They would never say, what organization do you belong to?
No, yeah, and then it is true, as you say in the first 4 lines on page 189, that these big denominations in Christendom, which are not religious systems, by the way, but denominations completely separate as organizations, they all believe in the Trinity, and some of them believe in the immortality in the soul and hellfire. Some of them, all of them teach and believe in the Trinity, but not all of them believe in the immortality of the human soul, as you seem to imply here. In fact, if you look at the creeds of Christendom, the first 7 of them, the ecumenical creeds of the first 7 or so centuries, not one of them that I'm aware of teaches any official doctrine on the immortality of the soul or hellfire. But they do teach on the Trinity. So a part truth again, mixing truth with error. And your assumption, though, in the very first sentence on that page, they had absorbed these religious systems of Christendom. They had absorbed doctrines and customs from ancient Babylon. This is just not true. This is Alexander Hislop's Two Babylons narrative, and almost nobody in Christendom even credits that book, although it was written by a clergyman of Christendom, by the way, and you're using it. Another thing that most witnesses don't seem to realize. But Hislop's point was not that the Trinity is a false doctrine. And everybody who even reads the book and believes in it doesn't believe everything that's in that book, because Hislop writing the book predates the growth of archaeology. So a lot of what we learned in the very next generation, Russell's generation, would discredit what Hislop said about the dispersion of Babylonian doctrine all over the planet. Now, we've spoken to that before, but you're just plain wrong. And Fred Franz, of course, passes this on through Babylon the Great Has Fallen, his book from the 1960s. You haven't got over this, which is Christendom didn't get these doctrines from Babylon.
Yeah.
Because Babylon didn't have a system of doctrines.
I think when witnesses even hear the word immortality and hell and fire, they immediately say, well, that's not biblical. And yet those words are in the Bible.
Immortality is, for sure, but not
and
immortality
hell
of the soul.
is in the Bible. And when it's described, it does mention fire. So it's not... it's not true to say that it's not biblical. Now, even among the different denominations, their explanations or their interpretations differ, and that's not shown here.
No, there's no nuance
It's
here.
like they all believe this, and there's no real explanation at all.
But what you do prove here, I think, beyond a shadow of a doubt, is that 100 years after Charles Taze Russell, you're still obsessing over Russell's obsessions. His negative obsessions were over, well, you could say his bête noire or his pet peeves were 3. And they are the Trinity, the immortality of the soul teaching, and hellfire.
And they're still the same with the witnesses. Those 3 things are always focused on.
And you don't even seem to know that most Christians in Christendom, the hated enemy, don't obsess over these things. They don't even obsess over the Trinity, even though that one is the only one that's in the original creeds.
This thing about the church's record, lay bare the church's record of manipulation of governments for their own selfish ends.
Yeah.
That too is a very general statement, and if you just look at the Protestant denominations, they are very much for separation of church and state.
Well, at least in North America they are, and that's where Russell starts, and all the cults really get going. Almost all of them get going in America. So it's not representing the truth about your own continent and the Protestant churches of North America.
Yeah, so you just put everyone in the same category.
And they're not busy, although that is true of some clergymen, mostly very visible media clergymen, who are now very involved in trying to push for certain aspects of you might say, foreign policy, American foreign policy. It's not been true of the churches generally over the centuries. They haven't. They've had no control over what their government does because they're always in the minority. That is, evangelical Christians, and Protestants are evangelical Christians. They are always in the minority in any country they're in.
You should never think you can get history in a paragraph.
That will force you to do generalizations.
Yeah, that's right.
And then when you get to talking about, oh boy, this part, about the 10 million copies, you're now thinking is some kind of heroic gesture of the brothers
to expose Christendom.
This hard-hitting expose of Christendom, 10 million copies on the subject, the fall of Babylon. What are you not telling your own people here?
I'll tell you one thing they're not telling you. What they actually believed about
Christendom and Babylon.
And what would happen to them. So, first of all, they believed that Babylon had already fallen when the finished mystery was written.
Yeah, it had fallen
in 1878.
And what was going to happen in 1918, which you don't mention here?
This is what the finished mystery says will happen. It says, in the year 1918, when God destroys the churches wholesale and the church members by millions, it shall be that any that escape shall come to the works of Pastor Russell to learn the meaning of the downfall of Christianity. They don't even say Christendom, they say Christianity. You want the downfall of Christianity? But the churches will be destroyed wholesale and their members.
By the millions.
That doesn't sound kindly.
Yeah.
The last thing here was about people writing letters of withdrawal from their churches kindly, giving a kindly witness. Well, they obviously weren't giving him a copy of this.
No, they weren't setting a very good example for the brothers who tried to write kindly letters to the churches they were departing from, right? And that they were reading those letters in their churches. You admit that here. That's better than the chance you give to so-called apostates today.
Yeah.
We ask for that. We ask for a chance to speak to the congregation before we
and
departed.
many people who have left have written letters. We wrote a letter and our documentation from their own literature to give to anyone who had inquired as to why we were leaving, our friends and my family. And yet they're told not even to read it, not to look at it.
Not to look at it.
If somebody writes a letter who leaves the Watchtower, you're told not to look at their explanation. You don't have that freedom that the churches had, where people could hear why you left.
No, we know quite a few people who recently have written letters of disassociation, knowing full well that if they don't, they'll be harassed until they do.
Yeah.
And when they do, they have no expectation, though. They have no expectation of these letters even being read by their loved ones, let alone to the congregation.
Yeah.
They give them to the elders, and they take it on the chin after that. But I do want to make the point that this hard-hitting expose of Christendom was obviously not what you say it was here. It was a hard-hitting expose of Russell, the Rutherfordites, and all the people in control of the Watchtower in 1917 and 18. It exposed them for the false prophets they clearly were. Now you've made it into a heroic, courageous stance that you took.
Yeah.
And then you've turned around on the clergy and said this resulted in bitter animosity. If you've read the finished mystery, you know the bitter animosity started with you.
Yeah.
You were the one dumping on the clergy and saying they were all going to be destroyed the next year.
And the clergy would react. You would think they would react, anyone who read this material. But for the most part, people, the majority of the clergy probably didn't think about the witnesses at all. Even today, we think we were the center of everything. We're like little kids who, I'm the center of the world. And everybody knows and thinks about Jehovah's Witnesses. Well, the truth is, no. A lot of people don't think about you at all.
And if you're inclined to challenge what Vivian just said, just read the books of the clergymen who wrote books in that very era or before that, while Russell was alive, mind you. Very few of them even mention Russellism or Charles Taze Russell by name. When they do, it's because they're talking about prophecy, and they might mention that the Russellites have these peculiar views. But it has to be to the topic. Most clergymen are just too tied up caring for the needs of their local churches, writing their sermons, or even writing books. So you can read Alexander Maclaren. I've never seen a reference in Maclaren or Ryle or any of those contemporaries to Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yeah.
Although you do find an occasional one in a famous author today. We found F.F. Bruce in his little book on the Epistles of John, where he says, if a Jehovah's Witness comes to your house,
invite them in for a cup of tea.
Invite them in for a cup of tea, a very English thing to do. So even when they do reference the witnesses, as George Peters famously did in his Theocratic Kingdom of the Lord Jesus Christ, 2,000 pages, by the way, the most thorough book ever written on the subject that I've ever seen, he does reference Russell and and Barber. He references them both, even though that book is in the 1880s, because it's on the subject, the Theocratic Kingdom.
So he's going to reference everything he can find that people talk about that.
But you're in a rush to make the clergy the enemy, always the enemy, despite the fact that the worst they've done, for the most part, is ignore you. I guess you can't take that, right? So let's see, have we covered it all? A hard-hitting expose. Yes, it's a hard-hitting expose of the poverty of Russellism.
One thing maybe that you didn't talk about is Babylon. Babylon didn't have a Trinity.
That's true. So, we could say that. You've misrepresented even the doctrine of the Trinity. It's not only not Babylonish, but the pictures you see constantly in your magazines, when you do an article about the Trinity, you always show pictures of three-headed gods, pagan triads. That's not Trinity, by the way. Not Trinity. It's a triad. That is three gods.
Yeah.
And then there's the famous, of course, mother and child. So somehow linking it to adoration of Mary in the Roman Church, but she's not part of the Catholic Trinity either.
Yeah, any Trinity of the Church. The Church doesn't have Mary as part of the Trinity.
So this linking it with Babylon is totally useless. The closest analogy would be Greek philosophy, where there are notions about complexity within the Godhead, and how would that complexity work. So if you want to trace it to, you want to trace a connection to pagan philosophy, maybe. But that's not what you're doing here. You're saying it all goes back to Babylon.
Yeah.
And you're just plain wrong.
Yeah.
So try to find it. I did, by the way. I tried to find the Trinity in Babylon, and I studied and I collected books on Babylon, and it's nowhere.
And as they have said, confusion is what the word means, Babylon. So they didn't have a system.
Yeah.
They didn't have an organized religious system
with an official orthodoxy
and teachings.
As you imagine.
Yeah.
Not even so. It doesn't connect to Nimrod and his mother. That's the thing you got from Hislop. Many fundamentalist Protestants have the same idea because they've read the same book, and that's why it's still being reprinted endlessly. It's a mixture of error and truth. There's a lot of truth in it, but there's too much error. So don't follow Fred Franz, and don't follow people who, like Fred Franz, feed only at the table they want to feed at all the time. Instead of going to the scholars about Babylonian religion and about the world of the Old Testament and getting some accurate information from people who study the subject, you go to the popular guys. And cults, of course, specialize in confirmation bias, going to the sources they want to get the information they desire. What's our link? We're
going to link to a video where we explain or talk more about this 1918 God Destroys the Churches Wholesale. So a fuller video on that. And the Ezekiel playlist.
See you next time.